I think okay, so I think we can get started. So welcome everybody. We're here today to talk about two really sort of critical facets of building a future that is sustainable in terms of getting resources that we need to build renewable energy, and how we balance that with some of the issues of justice and the protection of people's rights in the environment. So in particular, there are some really staggering projections for resource demands in order to not just build renewable energy sources, but to transition our infrastructure and energy grid over to systems that can handle that kind of stuff. But at the same time, if we're going to have such a huge demand for resources, we need to be able to mine new resources in a way that is that protects the environment and the rights of local people and indigenous communities who are going to be associated with those activities. So today is really looking at sort of those two balancing perspectives and in a very forward-looking way for what we're going to need in a sustainable economy future. So kind of on that note, I'd like to kind of, before we go any further, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement that we are all, and most of us, I think, certainly I am, gathered here on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Musqueam people. Today is in many ways quite topical in relation to our relationship with Indigenous peoples. They're folks who are on the ground and have a close relationship with the land, where, for example, a lot of mining activities can be carried out. And that means that they are both holders of rights and stakeholders in those places, and they have a much better attachment to the land usually in those places than most of those who come in as miners. And that means they can have really positive relationships with folks doing resource extraction, but they can also bear the worst impacts of negative impacts. So I think today's hopefully a discussion that can teach us all a little bit about how to handle some of those issues a little better. So today we have two very special guests to talk about this. We have Dr. John Steen and Dr. Sarah Ghebremusse. And John is the EY Distinguished Professor in Minerals and Mining at UBC and is the director of the Bradshaw Research Institute for Minerals and Mining. He has not one, but two PhDs, one in biochemistry and one in business strategy at the University of Queensland. And his major research focuses on innovation and sustainability in resources and in the mining sector. So among his many accolades and activities, he is an advisor for the BC Mining Association, as well as the BC government on mining strategy and innovation. And then our other guest, Sarah, is an assistant professor at the Peter A. Allard School of Law, where she has degrees from the University of Alberta, Carleton University, University of Ottawa, University of Toronto, and the Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. She specializes in African mining, law and development, and human rights in the global south. And she's currently a PI on a project looking at mining conflict with two Canadian companies in Tanzania and Zambia. And she's particularly looking at the effect of Canadian corporate influence on institutional change and transformation in those countries. So that's the quick overview of our two speakers today. I'm not going to talk anymore. For now, I'll hand it over to John, who can get this started off.
Great, thanks very much, Colin, and thank you for that introduction. Just while I get this going. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and just before I start, thank you very much to the School of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences for holding this. It's great to have a dialogue across the faculty, because we do tend to stay in our little rabbit warrens, and you know, it's good to be able to learn about different perspectives, different research, and engage in a scholarly discussion. So thank you very much to Philippe and the EOAS group for initiating this. I won't say too much. I mean, the idea was that we would engage in a discussion, but I will sort of fill out some of those figures around the challenge on the energy transition and the burden that it places on for the provision of the metals. One of the researchers, and he's a former policy advisor to Barack Obama as well on energy policy, is Jason Bordoff, and he's a very interesting person to follow on Twitter. But Jason's very good at capturing just how big this challenge is. The challenge of sustainability in the 21st century and getting to a sustainable climate situation, a stable climate situation. And this is a quote I picked up a while ago, and he actually made it on air in an interview. But previously, when we've been doing energy transitions, from wood to coal to petroleum, it's all been about capacity additions. The other products that we've used to power the global economy have still been there. What we're attempting to do now has never been done before. In addition to adding, all this renewable energy and setting ourselves up for a zero carbon energy grid, we've also got to remove the other fossil fuels that have been embedded in our economy, for hundreds of years. So this is a very, very serious challenge. And I think I don't need to tell you that to get this happening, everything needs to go right. Everything needs to fall into place to get this happening. It is a seriously difficult technical challenge, in addition to a political challenge and a social challenge. So I'll talk more about the technical aspects and the economic aspects, and Sarah is more qualified to talk about the social and institutional aspects of this challenge. But just to remind ourselves, there's renewable energy is important and necessary, but there's no free lunch. A 3 megawatt turbine, just to choose the case of wind power, a 3 megawatt turbine, which isn't the biggest turbines, by the way, they're now building them much, much bigger than this. And this is from the World Bank, 4.7 tons of copper in one turbine, 335 tons of steel. The rare earth elements, the things that the West stopped producing some time ago because they're too polluting, they're now produced in China. So China has cornered the market on rare earths and potentially can hold Western advanced manufacturing to ransom. 2 tons of those, and the list goes on. And we've got to create many, many, many fields of these things to replace the energy system that we've built over the last couple of 100 years. So, you just take the case of one wind turbine. It's a serious challenge. This is also from the World Bank. And this is looking at, what sort of increase do we need to have in annual production to meet sustainability targets. This is the World Bank's data. Lithium is nearly 10 times, cobalt's nearly 5 or 6 times, vanadium, nickel. The quote I like from this one is we'll need as much copper in the next 25 years as we've produced in the whole of human history to electrify the global economy. So this is the important point here. This is new metal. A lot of these metals are already heavily recycled. They're valuable. The recycling rates are already quite high. They can be, with innovation, with higher prices, they can be higher. But we're looking at new metal here, and it's unless we can think of some way to change the way that we make and produce electric power, there's no way around it here. This is a similar report recently from the International Energy Agency. And by the way, if you go to the nature journals, if you go to Energy Policy or any other journal, peer-reviewed journals, you'll find similar figures. I haven't cherry-picked data here. You know, it's all pretty consistently, you know, the same. But here we have IEA saying, look, how much to meet, you know, if we pursue the climate targets to meet Paris Agreement targets, how much difference does it make compared to current stated policies? So the red dots there are metal demand to fuel the clean energy transition under stated policies. And the blue bar is what we would need to achieve to reach Paris climate targets. And you look at all of those metals, you know, the takeaway is the more aggressively we pursue climate action, the more it increases the demand for new metals. Right? So we're in this really difficult place. You know, we want to get to a zero carbon position, you know, net zero. You can argue about what that is or what that isn't, but it's a metal driven future, and there's no way around it. You know, World Bank, International Energy Agency, you know, environmental groups, it's just something that we're stuck with. There's no way around it. So one thing that we've been looking at, and this is research that's just been published today in one of the Nature journals, Nature Communications. This is one of my PhD students, Benjamin Cox, who's an economist. What he's saying is that, and I guess this is a good news story, that the economic value produced from these metals is so great that even at carbon taxes, $150 a tonne doesn't really impinge much on the economic value of these metals. It's only when you start getting to the really energy intensive areas like smelting, aluminium and steel, that we're really getting, you know, particularly when those grids are on carbon based fuel sources, that we really start getting into carbon taxes really, you know, impacting, or, you know, getting close to what the value of these metals are. So the argument is that the global mining industry should be a strong advocate for, you know, carbon prices, even up to $150 a tonne and more. It hardly changes the economic value of the metals, and what's more, it stimulates demand. So if you like, I think sometimes we think of mining as being in polar opposites. You know, mining is the enemy of climate action. Increasingly, we're seeing that distinction not being true, because though climate action and mining actually have to go together if we want to get to this point, this very, very difficult point of reaching Paris targets. It's an unlikely pairing, but it's one that has overwhelming evidence for it. We have to find a way to make this work, to get them to work together. So the complication here, of course, is that mining itself produces emissions. You know, at the moment, where we are is getting to a point where we have to produce all these metals, but in doing so, we produce more carbon dioxide. So at the moment, we don't have the situation where mining metals gets us to a point where we get to that, reaching those Paris commitments. But I'd like to show you this report. This was done by McKinsey fairly recently, but you know, it stacks up with all the industry reports and everything that I've seen in terms of government accounting for carbon emissions. You know, the exact details vary from mine to mine and country to country, but you know, in relative terms, it's approximately makes sense. So I hope you're all familiar with the idea of different scopes of emissions. You know, scope 1 is essentially what gets produced in the act of mining. Scope 2 are the inputs. So if an Australian mining company sources energy from a coal-fired power grid, which most of it is in Australia, that's scope 2. And scope 3 are all the downstream emissions. So what you can see in the relative terms there is that or the relative sizes, you know, it's the scope 3 emissions. It's the downstream use of mine products to make heavy materials like steel, like aluminium, like coal-fired energy. That's where most of the emissions are. In terms of scope 1, the biggest problem here is methane. And this is something that we're just starting to get a sense of. Fugitive methane emissions are a huge problem for the industry. Personally, I think, I strongly believe that we need to have a pretty high price on carbon to get us away from thermal coal fairly quickly, as fast as possible. And a price signal is a good way to do that. There are some countries which don't have alternatives yet. I've spent a fair bit of time doing Australian economic development projects in Pakistan, and their power grid goes off regularly. They don't have sustainable power. And what happens in Pakistan if they lose power? A very hot day in Karachi, 50 degrees, people die. People die because they can't access reliable power. So at the moment, that grid is powered by coal, and a lot of the funding from that has come from China. A very complicated situation. But the point here is that a very, very small part of this is the emissions that are made by actual mining activities in a mine. And when we look at those emissions, about half of them are the trucks, the loading, the hauling. That's about half of the emissions, and most of the time that's diesel. The good news is that that's relatively easy to deal with, and many companies are actually dealing with that. One of the biggest investors in heavy hydrogen vehicles is Anglo American. They're making great progress in driving their vehicles, powering their fleet with hydrogen. And the benefits that we're seeing in electric vehicle technology, particularly battery power, that's spilling over into the mining sector as well. So the possibilities of electrifying the mining operations themselves are there, and it's happening. There's a mine near Princeton, which is actually electrifying its fleet as we speak. The other heavy part of the mining activity is crushing and grinding. That's obviously very energy intensive, but still, we're seeing a lot of miners around the world. If they're not on an electric grid like we are in BC, they're reducing their carbon footprint by having their own solar power grid or wind turbines or whatever. So this is all very achievable. The biggest problems are what happens downstream, particularly in smelting, and particularly in steel. Steel making, we don't have a good alternative yet for coking coal to make steel. We have no substitute as yet. But methane emissions certainly on site are something we can tackle, and that's some of the research that we're doing. How do we remove that? So it's actually quite an interesting story. There are some ways that we could easily, and we are seeing, reductions in carbon emissions, and some things that are more complex for different reasons. I'll just touch briefly on First Nations rights. And I've chosen this quote from Mark Podolazli, who's the Director of Economic Policy at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. In many places in the world, and that is Australia, Canada, or elsewhere, major projects, capital projects, energy projects, mining projects, hydro projects are important parts of the economy. They're important parts of socioeconomic development and sustaining the local economy. And he makes a really important point. Yeah, it's a non-starter if the deal for First Nations is, right, we've got to save the planet's atmosphere and the climate, but you lose, right? His point is that the First Nations are just going to say, no, that's not a fair deal. So he's saying, look, yes, we do want to see these projects go ahead, but we want to see them done in a way that's sustainable, culturally appropriate, and actually advances reconciliation and mining justice, climate justice, those things that we talk about. So it's not mining versus First Nations, it's how do we get these things to work together? And I want to give you some ideas about how this might work. I mean, I completely acknowledge that there are some dreadful examples, and they continue. And as scholars, researchers, activists, whoever we are, we should be horrified when companies blow up Indigenous sites of significance because it's legal to do so, like happened in Western Australia. We should be horrified when a mining company closes a mine but doesn't have the money to fund the remediation. This has happened recently in the Northern Territory, in Kakadu in Australia. Right? This is not acceptable. But there are some ways forward. This is a partnership, a pilot that was tried in the Tahltan First Nation territory in central BC. The idea was, why don't we try to remediate the creek, and we use the leftover gold from placer mining, in the bad days of mining several decades ago, to remediate the mine. And it works. Apple and Tiffany were buyers of the gold, and it's worked to remediate the mine. BRIM, my research institute that I lead, is now getting involved in this type of work. The idea is that, can we develop clean tech to enable remediation of First Nations mine sites where they're dealing with these legacy mines that have been sitting there for decades, just leaching acid metals? Can we clean them up? Can we actually recapture and sell the metals? Can we reforest the area and then allow the First Nations to capture that value as carbon credits? So what I'm saying is that innovation is a way forward. There are all sorts of interesting innovations that have come out of UBC and mining, ranging from more accurate assessment of underground ore bodies using muon subparticles, right through to ore sorting technologies where we produce a fraction of the waste rock, right through to biotechnology, which removes selenium from contaminated water in the Elk Valley. So this is the type of research that UBC does in mining. And it's not going to, we can't solve everything, but we do try to get to that position where we can produce those metals needed for the 21st century to get to that sustainable climate position without the impacts that we've seen in the last century. And I'll just leave it there.
Thanks very much for that really engaging talk, John. So we'll carry it on through, and Sarah, we'll give you the floor.
Okay, thanks, Colin. And as I load my PowerPoint, I just want to say thank you. Thanks to you and to the other organizers for inviting me to speak at today's Colloquium series. I'm really excited to share my perspectives on mining and mining's impact on climate change, and discuss some of the social aspects of mining that John alluded to in his presentation. I think as a starting point, I do want to say that I agree with a lot of what John said. I think mining is essential for the world to, not just move towards a green economy and transition to less reliance on fossil fuels, but even in the present, just to maintain our own standards of living and to promote economic and social development in large parts of the global South. But what I do disagree with when it comes to mining is a lot of the practices that are carried out in the industry that devalue the rights of local and Indigenous communities, and that also cause significant harm to the local environment in a lot of the places where mining is carried out. So my comments today will first introduce you to what are the current colonial capitalist underpinnings of the mining industry. And I think a lot of that history we sometimes lose sight of when we think about the ways in which mining needs to be reformed. I'll then going to provide a critical overview of the state of mining in areas of environmental degradation and human rights. And I'll also emphasize the role of that Canadian mining companies play and exacerbating many of the inequities that exist and are perpetuated in the mining industry. And then I'll conclude my presentation like John did with some sort of forward thinking or forward looking recommendations. And these essentially echo and amplify those that were included in the open letter that Students for Mining Justice and the AMS Indigenous Committee wrote to UBC as the university was considering its climate emergency report. And essentially there is no climate justice without mining justice, and how we go about doing that is something I'll speak to at the end of my presentation. And so contemporary mining, and I'm sure this is something that isn't new for a lot of you who are joining this workshop today. Contemporary mining has its roots in 19th and 20th century colonialism. I mean, it was the pursuit of natural resources that led to European powers to colonize so much of the world, including Canada. And through this sort of scramble for the new wealth that occurred throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries, that essentially led to the displacement of significant portions of local and Indigenous communities. They were removed from their lands. And in that process, they essentially became labor for the mining companies and the mines that were established in the wake of their displacement from their natural or traditional territories. And this created the structure that dominates mining and the capitalist underpinnings of the contemporary mining industry. Through that displacement of local populations and Indigenous populations, there were efforts put in place to actually advance the extraction of mines and minerals because of the value that these minerals actually presented. And as a result, there was a complete disregard or abandonment of some of the more traditional methods in which these communities actually mined. I mean, mining is something that has existed throughout much of human history, but it wasn't until the last 100 to 150 years where we really see the practice of mining and the technology behind mining really have a significantly dramatic impact on local populations and the local environment. The displacement of local peoples in order to establish mines was a way to subjugate these peoples. And we see that a lot today in the way mining is carried out in much of the world, including in Canada. There was an imposition of taxes that led a number of people in these local communities to become, as I said, like undervalued and underpaid employees in this capitalist mining system. This displacement also led to the imposition of foreign laws that created a system of land tenure that completely made it difficult and almost impossible in some instances for these local communities to repossess or reclaim their lands going forward. And that's why we see in Canada, this push amongst a number of Indigenous communities to take back the land because it was dispossessed from them through the imposition of foreign laws. And so natural resource extraction and mining specifically was an economic driver of colonization that, despite the movement to independence in the large parts of the world and in the global South, we still see the remnants of this colonial capitalist structure in place. And that leads to, a number of the, as I said, the significant negative impacts and detrimental impacts that mining has on local and Indigenous communities throughout much of the world. So the environmental impact that mining has, I mean, while John spoke about, the potential for mining to, account for and develop new technologies that could minimize the harmful impact that the industry has on the natural environment, there's a long history in the mining sector of significantly altering the local environment and producing harmful consequences that in a lot of instances, cannot be reversed. We know that mining just drastically alters the natural environment. I mean, if you look at some of the mines that are actually, dug, the level in which these companies must dig into the earth, displace the soil, and in that process, provide some mechanisms through which, the waste from mining could be protected and in some way not harm the local environment. While mining companies think they've reached a point where they can do this with regard to the local environment and minimize the impacts that they have, there are often times when we see impacts like this, where a tailings pond, for example, could collapse, and the waste that was contained in that pond leach into the local environment and into the local water supply of the community that lives in that area. John also spoke to the irony that while mining is needed to help reduce carbon emissions, mining currently does have significantly contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And so if you were to think about the ways in which mining could potentially promote climate justice, there has to be significant effort and attention paid to the ways in which mining care takes place, and ensuring that the practice of mining in some way could lower the greenhouse gas emissions that the mines actually emit. Furthermore, there has to be significant attention also given to the water that mines use and the level of water that is required in order to actually carry out the practice of mining. As we know, climate change is having a significant impact on the reliability of water supply in a number of areas. We see drought taking place such that local communities are competing with natural resource companies for access to local water supplies. If mining is to actually promote climate justice, some consideration as well has to be given to the access to water that the mines need, as well as local communities. And so there's a number of examples of mining's harmful impact on local environments. In addition to the tailings disaster that's pictured here that was taken in Brazil, there's also an instance of a tailings pond dam collapse in BC in 2014 at the Mount Poly mine. In addition to this disaster in Brazil that's pictured here from 2019, there was also a recent spill in March of last year that involved the Canadian mining company Equinox Gold. There's also examples of even the Canadian mining company Barrick Gold and the ways in which their mine, Perjera mine in Papua New Guinea, has also led to the poisoning of local water supplies, and that inhibits local populations and local communities from having access to a healthy environment. And mining companies are often allowed to perpetuate these harmful activities because while there are environmental measures in place to sort of fine companies for any harmful activities and undue damage that occurs, it's not always the case that fines are enough to actually reverse the practices of mining companies. And oftentimes mining companies from the global north do benefit from the lax environmental standards that are in place in large parts of the world where mining is taking place. So we don't always see in countries of the global south environmental measures that are sufficient to actually deter mining companies from carrying out these harmful acts. And instead, we see a number of instances repeating themselves as we did in Brazil, and as we see at a number of mines around the world, where the natural environment is harmed and local communities just lose access to the natural environment that and in their traditional territories that they benefited from for hundreds of years. We also know of the harmful impacts that mining has on human rights of Indigenous and local communities around the world. And what I've pictured here for you is a number of protests against Canadian mining companies specifically, and the pursuit of human rights and the accountability of mining companies for the violations of human rights has a tumultuous history in Canada, because it wasn't until the last 10 to 15 years really where we've seen Canadian mining companies being held accountable for some of their human rights violations that they've carried out abroad. In 2013, there was a landmark case brought in Ontario against the Canadian mining company called Hudbay. And Hudbay was accused of murdering, or at least hiring, a security company that murdered and harmed local communities in Guatemala that were protesting their mine. That was followed a few years later by litigation brought here in BC against Tahoe Resources and against Nevson Resources, two Canadian mining companies that were operating in Guatemala and Eritrea, respectively. And the human rights violations that these companies were accused of being complicit in were, again, pretty severe, directly harming local communities that were in opposition to their mine, in the case of Tahoe Resources, and in Eritrea, being complicit in the extreme human rights violations that the Eritrean government was carrying out at Nevson's Bisha mine, where they actually used conscripted labor and subjected them to horrendous labor conditions, all in the pursuit of extracting some minerals. And so of these cases that have been brought in Canada, the one against Hudbay is continuing in the courts, and the lawsuits against Tahoe Resources and Nevson Resources were settled out of court. But what all of these cases point to is sort of the lack of regulation within Canada for the harmful activities of Canadian mining companies overseas. And there's an urgent and pressing need to address the violations of human rights that these companies carry out, because Canada plays a significant role in the global mining industry. If we take a look at my next slide, I've captured this, or I've copied this image here that I took from Natural Resources Canada's website. And it gives you an illustration of the vast mining assets that Canadian companies hold around the world. And you can see largely these assets, while there's significant investment in Canada and in North America generally, a number of these assets are actually held in the global south, where a lot of countries, even 50 to 60 years after the end of colonization, a number of these territories are still grappling with effectively regulating mining activities in such a way that there is due respect for the rights of local communities, due respect for the regulations that the state would like to impose, and due respect for the equitable distribution of the wealth that is actually generated from this extractive activity. Because in so many parts of the world, the communities in which mining is taking place are impoverished. They lack the access to some basic services that are present in other parts of the country, because the mine is detrimentally altering their local environment. Their access to a healthy environment is also impacted. And so Canada also plays a significant role in the pursuit of mining justice that ultimately aids in the pursuit of climate justice. And so this country needs to play a greater role in ensuring accountability of mining companies, most effectively through legislation. Because the fact that we've had litigation take place in this country points to the fact that the Canadian government has not yet seen fit to actually regulate these companies through effective legislation, and then instead has passed or put in place some corporate social responsibility policies and standards that a lot of these companies pay lip service to, but are not really following effectively. And so when we think about, when we're thinking ahead about what is really needed to, transform the mining sector and to ensure that, mining and mining justice works in the pursuit of climate justice, I wanted to, as I said, endorse and echo and amplify the recommendations that Students for Mining Justice and the AMS Indigenous Committee spoke to in their open letter to UBC, the cover of which I've copied into my slide for you today. I think what the students were speaking to was the urgent need to respect and uphold the rights of local and Indigenous communities. And the way in which that could take place most effectively is through the implementation of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. We would also in this country have given lip service to that principle through the legal measures that are in place to actually consult with Indigenous communities. That falls short of the standard that free, prior, and informed consent is actually calling for. Now, Canada has actually passed and endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the University of British Columbia has also endorsed that declaration. But to fully realize it and to fully ensure that mining justice can actually become a realization and contribute to climate justice, we would need to see full implementation of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. And I think where I slightly differ from the Students for Mining Justice and the Indigenous Committee is that this principle is not one that should operate just exclusively for Indigenous communities. I think when we're looking at standards of human rights that mining companies should respect for just any community that is affected by mining, the extension of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent to all communities that are affected by mining can ensure that mining is taking place in these communities in a sustainable way that actually respects the natural environment and respects the rights of those communities. And so I'll end my comments there, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really great and very thought-provoking. So we're going to go into discussion pretty shortly. Before we do, I just have a couple of quick points. First of all, I think as we've just seen, these issues and both of the perspectives that we've just seen involve a lot of difficulty, and I think it involves some real challenges that will take some courage and a lot of radical integrity to face. So I just want to applaud both of our speakers today and anyone who wants to step into those challenges. I think it's a really worthy endeavor. And on that note, both Sarah and John have made themselves available tomorrow from 11 a.m. to noon for a follow-up discussion, particularly with any students who are interested. So I'm just going to put a sign-up link for that in the chat. And for any students in the room who are interested in learning a bit more about these perspectives and really just engaging in that discussion, I encourage you to sign up there, and we can continue the conversation a bit more past today. And then the last thing that I want to mention before we can get over to questions is just a quick plug for next week's colloquium. So next week we have a panel discussion with three guests. We have Dr. Amanda Jiang from the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability here at UBC. We have Tom-Pierre Frappé-Sénéclose from the Pembina Institute, who's Regional Director in BC. We have Fiona Beattie, who's a PhD candidate in zoology. And the broad theme for next week is really discussing how science and scientists can intersect with policy and planning for things like climate adaptation and mitigation, both at local place-based scales as well as sort of broader overarching planning, and sort of how that intersects with the realm of policy and that kind of thing. All right, so that's enough for me. Please, your questions and discussion, carry on. Philippe.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Thanks, John and Sarah. My question perhaps is more directed towards Sarah area of expertise, particularly around transnational law. And I wonder to what extent there's a parallel between what happens in mining and what happens in the international shipping industry, where companies will fly these flags of convenience, and Canadian companies or American or whatever companies operate under local legal jurisdictions that are very different than their own national context. Does that create a really significant, is that kind of the crux of a lot of the problems here?
Partly, yeah, but I think in essence, I mean, a lot of these companies have to go to jurisdictions where these minerals are located, right? And so we know in large parts of the global south that there are, like just large quantities of these minerals that are just waiting to be mined. And so I think a lot of countries go there, and in a lot of instances, we see less foreign shopping in terms of companies, seeking out jurisdictions where the regulations are lax. I mean, that could be the case in some instances, but I think we also see a lot of companies, and this is particularly true for Canadian companies, utilizing government resources and sort of diplomatic means to actually ensure that their investment in these global south host countries could take place in a way that really protects that investment, protects that mine, and in a lot of ways, prioritizes and elevates that mine status within the country, such that they have almost like this protected status within that country. And so over the last 20 years, we saw this, especially under the Harper government, where Canada used tools of investment and investment agreements, and altered the terms of those agreements, or framed them in such a way that if there was any impact, if this country were to take any action on those mines, that these companies had recourse to sue these countries and investment tribunals, or bring some other action that kind of undermines the policies or the regulations that these countries would look to impose. We also saw that in the structuring and a lot of the agreements that these companies reach with these countries, where provisions are in place to ensure that the taxes that they are bound to pay, any of the royalty rates that they're bound to pay are low, might even be lower than the desired rate that that country would like to impose, and would be in place for a very long time because of clauses that are agreed to within these contracts. And so I think while companies may select countries where they feel like they would have very little challenge in actually investing there, and because they will have very little resistance through these states' regulations, we also see them in oftentimes going even a little bit further and using diplomatic means and using contracts in order to ensure that their investment really faces little opposition from the host country.
I see. Thanks.
I have a question about a model for how to address mining injustices. So, for example, are there any examples of mining injustices committed in countries outside of Canada by Canadian mining companies that, in your opinion, Sarah, or John for the matter, you think have been addressed properly and corrected, and the practices have been corrected and are an example of how to go about doing this on, say, for example, a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I'm so often focused on the instances where it goes wrong, and not really give much consideration to examples where it could go right. And so John might have some.
Yeah, I mean, you take the example of Tahoe Resources. Eventually, that was taken over by Pan American Silver, which is a lot larger and more mature company, and the settlement that was made with Pan American to try to get some sort of justice for the people who'd been oppressed under Tahoe. I think that's an example. it's a slow process, but we're slowly seeing more companies trying to do a better job with this, and we can see Canadian companies who actually do a very good job, you know, in local like country settings. You know, I think I'm a fan of regulation, like Sarah is. And I absolutely agree that we should get firmer, clearer regulations, both in Canada for these companies and where they operate, because the Canadian mining sector is very interesting. It's a lot of small companies, quite different from Australia. Australia has much larger companies there's a lot more oversight and governance. But Canada, I think, has been its plethora of small companies has made it open to, you know, small things going unnoticed. They'll operate one mine in a country somewhere that doesn't get a lot of coverage, and I think that's been unfortunate. It has led to some outcomes the outcomes that Sarah's talking about, where there has been very blatant exploitation.
And there've been some just to also answer your question again, Yoshi, there've been times when, you know, Canadian companies have tried to provide redress for individuals that have been harmed either through the practices of security firms, you know, that they've hired, or local police that have carried out you know, enforcement measures you know, at the insistence of the mine. And I think credit should go to some of these companies. And I'm thinking of, you know, Barrick Gold in particular, that set up a grievance mechanism for harms committed at the North Mara mine in Tanzania and at the Pajara mine in PNG. And there was, you know, through this mechanism, you know, an effort to actually provide redress for, you know, victims of harm. I mean, there's still a lot of, you know, shortcomings in the grievance mechanism that Barrick adopted, both at North Mara and at Pajara. But I think, you know, there are efforts that are taking place, as John said, by a number of companies to either, you know, provide redress or to sort of preempt, you know, some of the harm that could actually take place by instituting, you know, a number of policies, whether you call them, you know, corporate social responsibility policies, sustainability policies, human rights policies, but preempt some of the harm that could take place by instituting policies and actually implementing them at a lot of their mines overseas.
Thank you.
David, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question for John. I was struck by your first two slides, one about numbers and the other one on the materials that go into making a 3 megawatt wind turbine. And it reminded me of my favorite book on sustainable energy by David McKay. And the mantra for the whole book is, we need numbers, not adjectives. So I'm totally in tune with that. So my question is, given the demand or the requirement of minerals and metals and so forth for making one turbine, and multiply that through the aggressive programs to expand wind power, have those demands or shortages kicked in yet? Or when might they kick in plans to expand wind turbines?
Yeah, I mean, the place where it's obviously kicking in and forcing up battery prices, it was the battery story. It's lithium, cobalt, nickel, you know, the essential ingredients that we have for batteries. And some people might say, "Oh, you know, who needs those cars anyway?" But it's also the standing storage that these batteries give to stabilize renewable energy-based grids. So if the prices of these technologies don't fall, their ability to replace fossil fuels is limited. So at the moment, we're already seeing supply problems and rising prices, particularly with lithium, and for the displacement of fossil fueled vehicles and fossil fueled energy. It's a real problem. Yeah.
All right, David, if you feel good about that answer, Michelle has a question.
Great. Thank you both, Sarah and John, for your comments. And thank you also to Colin for putting all this effort in to bring this together. I'm really happy that we're discussing this because I think it's such an important topic for the Earth Science Department. So I have, I guess, two comments / questions. The first is, I think it's really, really awesome that, we can all agree on the fact that we need more regulation. We need stronger regulation to hold companies accountable. So I was wondering if you, Sarah, but John too, if you'd like, could speak a bit more about like what that looks like, what specific regulation we need. I've heard that of a coalition in BC around BC mining law reform, as well as coalitions Canada-wide around corporate accountability legislation. And more specifically, what is the role of like earth scientists and scientists who are working with these companies in working to get that legislation implemented and helping to hold these corporations accountable? And then secondly, I think one thing that I just like to add into this conversation is I think we really also, when we're talking about demands for minerals, of course, like the amount of minerals we need is going to increase, but those metrics are going to, depend on the scenarios we're using in terms of like consumption levels. And so I think we need to be having a conversation about, global inequalities in terms of consumption, and how like what is actually a fair level of material use in the global north, and looking at like unnecessary consumption in the global north, and how we're measuring economic progress, and all of that, because after a certain point, increased consumption does not equate to increased levels of well-being. And then also part of that is like how we structure the energy transition. Does every single person need to have an individual electric vehicle, or can we build public transportation systems like high-speed rail? And so I think that if we, those are very hard conversations too, but if we start having those hard conversations, that could play into these levels of minerals that we need. So I love to hear your comments on both of those pieces. Thank you.
Sarah, would you like to go first? Or?
You can take a stab at it first, John.
Sure,
if you want.
sure. Yeah, so the regulation piece is interesting, and I'll take an angle on this because it's probably going to be quite different from Sarah's, but there's a really interesting relationship that's starting between technology and the trade of goods across the world. So at the moment in the EU, for a manufacturer, the materials that come into EU have to meet certain criteria. They have to, we're getting to a point where mine materials have to prove that they have a carbon footprint. Okay, so how do you do that? It's not like these things come with a stamp on them. A copper pipe doesn't come with a stamp on it saying this is X grams of carbon. But what we're seeing is the growth in distributed ledger technologies, which actually enables, if you like, transparency. A manufacturer for BMW to see through to the mine where this was actually produced. And there's a really interesting project that we're involved with at the moment with the BC government, which is about the BC government tagging the production of BC mines with their water footprint, their carbon footprint, other environmental monitoring that the governments do. So the manufacturer in Germany can actually see that and say, oh, that's that. Okay, so this is other product that comes out of somewhere else, and it doesn't meet those standards. One gets into Germany, one doesn't, right? So that's really quite interesting. The other thing I'll say, it's really good to read the International Energy Agency report, and I'd recommend that to you. One of the things that report assumed in their modelling was an overall net decrease in energy consumption, which really disturbs some conventional economists, because normally what we see is an iron link between economic growth and energy consumption. The IEA is saying we are assuming that we can actually decrease our energy consumption, and that will impinge on economic growth, but it's what we must do to become sustainable. So if you look at that carefully, the IEA in those metal projections, even though they're enormous, is in fact modeling decreasing growth, right? A bit of, not degrowth, but it's actually in there. So check that out, because I think it sort of calibrates where we are with the numbers in terms of, okay, what level of metal consumption can we get away with to get an acceptable level of economic development that's fair across the world? Because invariably what happens is the last economies to develop have to pay the high prices for all these renewable technologies that the West can enjoy. That's me.
Yeah, in answer to your regulation question, Michelle, I turned to some of the model law that NGOs have proposed in Canada to really ensure that there is some measure of accountability for corporations that carry out any environmental or human rights abuse, and also establish standards that these companies should follow, especially in their overseas operations. And there was an attempt 13 years ago now to actually pass such legislation. Unfortunately, it failed. And then there've just been, since then, efforts by Canada's corporate accountability NGO community and to revive the law or to make amendments to it. And so the legislation that and the regulation that I would envision would be sort of encompassing of that, imposing some, they said, like business and human rights standards, both with regards to the environment and with regards to the protection of human rights. I think John's idea of sort of ensuring that the metals that come into the country, or the ways in which Canadian mining companies just carry out mining is done in a way and is regulated in a way to ensure that it is both environmentally sustainable, reduces its impact on climate change, minimizes its harmful impacts on the environment, and also holds companies accountable for any human rights violations. Because the challenge that those 3 lawsuits that I spoke about illustrate is that for victims of these harms and abuses to receive any redress, they have to pursue litigation in this country, which isn't convenient for a lot of these individuals. And so this regulation could also include better or empowering Canada's ombudsperson for responsible enterprise as well, so that could act as a non-judicial grievance mechanism that is available to communities that suffer some kind of harm. So I think when you talk about regulation, I think really, to me, the sky's the limit, and that we should strive to include as much as we can or as much as we would like to in regulating industry, and hope that the legislation wouldn't be watered down in any way. Because the reason that proposed bill died in 2009 was that there was significant lobbying from industry to actually not pass the legislation. And so I would hope that in the efforts to actually generate any regulation, that while there has to be consultation with the industry, as well as affected communities, that we don't try to just bow down, the government doesn't try to bow down and just follow the preferred regulations of companies if they were even to go so far as to agree to it, because I think that's a significant hurdle that's in place. And your question about the role of earth sciences is very unique, because I think as a lawyer, I sometimes forget about the engineers and the scientists who are actually involved in the business of mining and the practice of mining and the role that they could play. But I think it's powerful, because if you think about who's actually working in these mining companies, I mean, there are a number of people who are concerned with the bottom line and ensuring that the mine maximizes profit as much as possible. But there are the scientists and the engineers like yourself and your colleague who would be potentially in a position to actually encourage that company to carry out its practices in a way that respects the environment and the human rights of the communities that are impacted. And so you're probably, being in the position that you will be in the future, in a much better place to actually enact change at that very local level, because as employees of the company, you do play a role in ensuring that that company is carrying out responsible business practices. And your second question about structuring the energy transition to ensure global equity, I mean, that is a very complex question that would require a very complex answer. Because I think right now we have several examples of how the attention to global impacts of business activity that has a harmful effect on climate change, on the distribution of wealth, are not really taking place. And the countries from the global south, activists from the global south, do try to raise awareness and bring attention to the harmful impacts that a number of global companies and countries of the global north are having on their daily lives. And there have been some international forums in which these discussions, at least attempts at these discussions, have taken place or could take place. Like we see COP, the COP forum being one where discussions of climate change are taking place internationally. You can look to the World Trade Organization to think about ways in which discussions of trade and potentially standards for industries could be discussed with a mind to the global impacts that these practices are having. I just don't see there yet being enough attention and consideration being given to sort of the global impacts and the ways in which global inequalities could be corrected. And so, yeah, I really don't have an answer to you other than, that more needs to be done. And I think the onus really needs to be on countries in the global north to, pivot their orientations and not just think inwardly at the impacts on their own states, but think about a number of these countries in the global south that, have suffered at the hands of companies that are based in the global north for a very long time, and that the onus needs to be on a lot of these countries in the global north to actually regulate these companies and ensure that these companies are carrying out practices in ways that could bring about greater global equity. So that is my sort of jumbled together answer to your very complex question, but I mean, I think that's something, that's a discussion that needs to continue, and I think all of us in some small part are a part of it because we are fortunate enough to live in Canada. So there's more that we could do to even push our government to be more mindful of the activities of Canadian extractive companies overseas, with a mind to addressing, as I said, these inequities that exist.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm just going to quickly jump in to say we'll keep the discussion going for folks as long as they want, but it is after 5 o'clock. So if anybody wants to jet, they certainly can. But in the meantime, Ben, you have a question.
I just first want to say thank you to Sarah and also the organizers for bringing in different perspectives, and especially kind of outside of the faculty and the industry. One quote that always kind of terrifies me and rattles around my head, I'm not exactly sure who it's attributed to, is it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. And that's something I think always terrifies me a little, working in our industry with some of the history and kind of complicated history Canadian companies have that's been addressed. And just bringing that back down to like geoscientists and working within this industry and recognizing we will be working for these companies with complicated histories, and they will be funding our research and our departments. Kind of just putting that out there as like a conversation starter, but also thinking, I know for myself, out of all the geoscientists, mining engineers I've met, and I don't want to say anything about older generations, but everyone who's been under 35 are extremely well-informed, care about, I'm going to say social responsibility. I know it's a buzzword, and climate change and communities. And I'm just kind of saying, or like asking the question of, do you think this is a matter of maybe something a little bit generational, or are the engineers and geoscientists not necessarily getting to boards or making these decisions? Because I would say this younger generation does care about this, but is that kind of a part of, maybe to be cynical, an institution that kind of goes to a bottom line? Or where does this kind of younger generation and these kind of attitudes come into actual business decisions? I know that's not exactly a question, but just kind of putting that forward to maybe John and Sarah.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Ben. So you know, there are generational views on environment, First Nations rights that stratify society, and because geoscience engineering tends to be historically white males, we get entrenched views. We are seeing changes in the boards and pressure to change. If you look at Ernst & Young does a survey every year of, you know, for the last 20 years of what executives in mining companies think are the biggest risks to their operations. For the last 3 or 4 years, and it's now entrenched, you know, that social license to operate. You know, can we even get permission to mine? Can we even get people to agree to let us onto the land? That is now the biggest number. Yeah, that's the number one risk. So everyone's on board with that, right? So this, you know, we're seeing the industry change. And no, I've got no contest with Sarah. You know, the history and still today we see some terrible things, but we're seeing some good things too. And I think we need to keep in mind, you know, what are the good things, the innovation that's coming through. One thing that did, and I'll just reference the report, the appendices in the climate report. One thing that, you know, and I agree, you know, with Sarah, no, to have climate justice, you need mining justice. You know, and this whole debate or discussion has been reaffirming that point. One part which was interesting for those of us who are faculty involved in mining, that was that the research that we do is against mining justice. And that was a quote taken out that was referenced from a submission. I think we need to be very careful about what we say there, because one of the best ways that we can actually change the industry is by working with it on solutions to tailings, solutions to recycling water, solutions to more accurate ore body assessment so we don't have to dig up any more rock than we need to, solutions to build legacy renewable energy systems that can be used for local communities after the mine is finished. So that, I guess, you know, that's one thing we need to be very careful about. We need to have measured activism that gets to us to a positive outcome, but we need to be careful what we attack, because some people within the industry are actually our allies, and certainly your faculty are your allies too.
I want to strongly agree, well, just from my experience, and I would not say faculty, you know, I threw out the number of like 35, but I'd say I think a lot of these younger generations, and I know from my experience being a recent undergraduate and a master's, these perspectives have been cultivated by faculty, and that education has came from faculty. And seeing, I just think of your presentation, Sean Barker, who's my supervisor, his presentations. This is the, you know, the answer for going forward, but just trying to think about a way as geoscientists and people working in the industry, how to make it a little less, you know, asymmetrical for the communities that this is taking place on their land versus the global need. And I think that's why I'm very encouraged by, you know, our mentors and the people we have learned from, yourself, Sean, and all. I did my undergrad at UVic, all my professors there, who have kind of cultivated this next generation. But then trying to also recognize a complicated history and some like asymmetrical environmental and, you know, value impacts as well. So I just want to put that out there.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, if I could just briefly answer your question, Ben. And I mean, it's great to hear that this is included in the curriculum at Earth Sciences and some of the mining programs that we have, so that UBC as a responsible institution is graduating students who are attentive to a lot of these social issues. So we're not just graduating, scientists who know the science that they need, but they're also familiar with the challenging social dynamics that take place in the industries that you're going to work in. I think the generational difference that you identified, Ben, is probably one that does contribute to some of the legacy that mining has had for a very long time. But I also think that I feel like that might be just too easy to point to, because I think we also have to understand some of the underlying logic that is foundational to mining. And it's not just older white men that we can blame for carrying out and not seeking to reform a lot of mining's harmful practices. But like mining as an industry, I mean, is embedded in the global capitalist system. And so as a company, its aim is to pursue and maximize profit. And oftentimes that is done with very little regard to the harmful impacts that company has in the environment in which it operates. So I think it will take, a significant change, and not just seeing these old white men retire from mining, but to the point that you made as well, like reforming a lot of the boards of these mining companies, bringing in, people with diverse perspectives, more racialized people, more women, people with diverse identities to these boards, and ensuring that a lot of the attention that's being given to responsible business practices is just not lip service. Because I think these companies know what they need to do or what they can to be responsible businesses, but it's just done as lip service with very little regard to the actual practices that are taking place. And one example of that a colleague of mine at the law school likes to point out, and she was, her name is Dr. Daniela Chimizo de Santos. She was critical to the law school's creation of this new mining law and sustainability executive program. And she gets lectured in my class last term and pointed out to students that, while Nevsun was operating its Bisha mine in Eritrea, and there was, increasing knowledge of the harm, the labor practices that were taking place there, and the, understanding that these were gross violations of human rights, Nevsun's share price did not change at all, right? So it was seen as an acceptable business risk to carry out some of these practices because the return on the investment is not affected in any way. So we know then that what is really driving mining is that pursuit of profit. So I think there has to be a significant systemic change for us to really see mining be reformed and actually, be an industry that can pursue a lot of these aims that they, contend that they are willing to follow. And so I value John's point that, there are a lot of examples of companies that are carrying out good practice. I just really would like to see this, across the board and see some systemic and structural reforms take place in the industry as well.
Yeah, I will just throw in something very quickly. There is a very good study which shows the cost, essentially shows the cost of conflict with gold mines in Africa by Witold Enisch. And Wit actually quantified the cost of conflict, and and what he showed is that there is a negative return to conflict. That the market pretty quickly works out on this. That this company risks not going ahead as a going concern. So, maybe not the Nevsun case in particular, but there's very, very good evidence that the market understands these risks to operations which come about from not acting ethically.
I remember, I just want to jump in, the systemic issues, I think those are the hardest, and they have implications for not just mining, but many industries, and are very wide ranging. But just focusing on mining, we had a student, I think it was Ethan, I forgot his name, who was a recent, I think, geological engineer grad going into industry. And then also him and Sean Barker. One, the student, Ethan, he was talking about how there's a stigma against students in earth sciences going into the mining industry, or oil and gas for that matter. And he was quite upset about it, or how should I say, saddened by it, because he wanted to be one of these young people starting their career with the intention of changing it from the inside. Yet he couldn't get through to some of his classmates about those intentions. He was just kind of written off and ostracized in a way. So I think there's a bit of an issue there, perhaps amongst the student body, to maybe not just ostracize people, not make things black and white, and look to work together and recognize that we're probably better off being partners in this rather than enemies. But to another point, I think Sean Barker brought up earlier last year that he was saying that the mining industry is actually worried that there's not enough young people coming in to the industry and filling ranks, and they're seeing a decrease, for example, in students pursuing natural resource extraction type degrees. John, maybe you could speak to that. Is there a significant drop off in that, and is that having a big effect on changing how these companies think about their reputation in these senses of mining injustice and whatnot? Is that actually a way that young people could affect change by saying, look, we're not going to join your industry unless you clean it up?
It totally is. And I've spoken to, I remember talking to a mining company, a coal mining company called Peabody. Most of their product is thermal coal, and they're operating big thermal coal mines in Australia, and they just couldn't get graduates for love of money. The graduates said, essentially they're voting with their feet. They were saying, we don't care how much money you're offering, we are not working in your industry. And so graduates are very good at actually looking hard and understanding what the companies are doing. And if they don't like what they're seeing, they leave. And that's a good thing. The problem is that the industry isn't very good at showing the good things that it does, some of the success stories. And as a consequence, another challenge to providing all these metals is actually finding people to work in the industry. It really is, the numbers are low all around the world. I mean, it's a great career choice at the moment. You could work for a fantastic company and name your price, but that's not good for the industry.
Michelle, did you still have your hand up for a question, or?
Oh no, I had just left that up.
I have a bit of a question just on the follow-up from this discussion. I'm curious from both Sarah and John, but also would like Ben's perspective on this. What do you think are the most important things that you would want a up and coming worker in the industry to know and to learn and to understand as they enter the industry, or as they're becoming into a position where they're able to affect change or decision making? So I would say, Sarah and John, from your perspectives, what are the most important things that you would like them to know? And then maybe Ben, what do you think is the most important thing that you've learned that's changed your perspective on things? I'll just ask.
I'll go first again. But I think the points that Sarah's making, we do have a long way to go in terms of making this industry sustainable. It's an industry that traditionally distributes value globally, but extracts locally, often in ways that doesn't return a fair portion of that international wealth to the local economy. That's the biggest problem, and that's why we're in this situation that we are now, in that so many mines aren't happening because there's just a complete lack of trust. If you look at what's happened in Serbia with the lithium mine, that lithium that's there in Serbia is completely important for the energy transition and supporting European manufacturers, but it's not going to be mined. And the reason is that the locals can point to mines that happened decades ago and said, look, this is what happened last time you turned up. You're not going to do it again. So we've got this massive trust problem. And I think until we sort out get the regulations right, what's fair, we start respecting local communities, First Nations rights, we're not going to get there. I think that's the big mission, I think, for today's graduates.
Yeah, I would just echo what John has said. I think it's that, this could be my bias as a social scientist and a lawyer, but thinking about what scientists actually study, it sometimes seems like it's just all like data and facts driven, and the social context could sometimes be forgotten. And so I think just, illuminating some of the lessons about what the science and the engineering behind these practices entail would be beneficial. And so understanding, every graduate from a mining or a geoscientist program should understand what FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent is, how it functions, how it should be engaged, and how it should be done effectively. It should also understand other ways in which the social license to operate should be obtained, because it should not be sort of a race to the bottom, whichever offer the community, the supposed spokespeople from the community an opportunity to request what it is that they need, and that is considered the social license to operate. But it would be actually to engage with the local community. Also think of ways that these companies can learn from the local communities, because they've lived in these territories for generations and have an understanding about how their local environment just functions and operates, and so could give some insights about how the practice, the mining could take place, where it's best to store any waste. And so there needs to be a more long-term relationship that corrects the power imbalances between corporations and communities. And so I think graduates need to understand that before they leave university and go into the world and actually start working for these companies.
Thank you, Sarah. And I can say probably the things that I've maybe learned from and for doing an undergrad and then starting my master's. And I think one thing for me, I come from some kind of hippie parents from the Sunshine Coast, but I'm working in mining and my brother works in forestry. So I don't know how happy they are about that. But I did definitely have some kind of conflict initially about, do I want to go work in the mining industry or natural resources? A big thing for me was I could either be, uneducated about this and not have as much of an informed opinion. And I'm not saying most people are by any means, but I just wanted to have a deeper understanding about the kind of issues and things I cared about. So I chose to go into geology, and I also love geology. And I personally wanted to have a greater understanding and then get knowledge and experience to actually work with industry or kind of either being partnered either with industry or government, but really trying to make sure I'm having conversations and trying to keep an eyes open perspective, which can be difficult. And I think one thing that's really important for students is kind of, this conversation has been fantastic for this, is highlighting the problems, but then also highlighting case studies and examples where things have gone well, because that is, I don't think it is just trying to have rose-tinted glasses. But I know that's one thing for myself, is I think everyone is aware that there is issues with the mining industry, there's connotations, but trying to find examples also coming from communities where there has been a beneficial partnership. And I just think I just came from attending Roundup virtually. They have the gathering place, and that's where there's conversations with First Nations communities and mining companies. And then just hearing some of the struggles there, but also hearing some of the mutually beneficial collaboration that they've had around COVID. And I think that is important to not try to be optimistic, but just also learn ways that different communities are working together. So that's one thing I think is good to understand, the problem, but also try to have some perspectives of like, what can we try to do ourselves? And then I'd say things that I've learned, always bring your hand lens, but that's not as important to the communities. I'd say just trying to listen, and then also recognizing a lot of geologists, not so much engineers, are the first boots on the ground as well. And that is, I think, so important to have a bigger perspective and try to have some, I don't know, just maybe, I know cultural awareness gets thrown around a lot, but having either some of that or also just geologists needing to do a bit of their own learning and understand this a little bit more, because they are kind of some of the first points of contact as well. So that's some of the things I'm kind of thinking about.
All right. And if there are no further questions at the moment, give it a sec, but otherwise that seems like a pretty great place to end it for today. And yeah, hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. I'll follow up with those who've signed up on that link presently. And let me just send that link one more time here before we go. All right, so if you're interested in having a bit of a follow-up in this, just follow that link. We'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock.